being overly providential, perhaps. There's the famous story of Doris Kearns Goodwin's memoirs, where she said she used to pray for harm to be done to the other baseball team that she didn't root for, and I think she felt guilty about that, you know. And so there's a sense of, there's a great guilt about wishing harm or having God on your side.
Okay, Elizabeth, did you want to?
Just a word. It's also a more outward century, a more outward-looking century, and I think that's part of the reason that the language changes. Now you have your republic built and going, and so for Truman, at least, he said that the United States had a responsibility, and that it was a God-given responsibility, and that it had failed in key respects in the first half of the 20th century, and he didn't want it to fail in the second half of the 20th century.
Okay. Another question, and unless the timekeepers tell me we're out of time, I want to take a few more, please. Thank you.
Thank you for those excellent presentations, as well as the first panel, too. And just to carry on the comparison between the early presidents and the 20th century presidents, I couldn't help but notice that the perception of the role of the president, of that position as a moral agent, is very strong in the 18th century and the 19th century, but it really becomes ambivalent in the 20th century. There is, in this past election, a tremendous expectation as well as a tremendous fear that whomever is elected will act as a moral agent. Just wanted to get some comments from you all about the change in the perception of the role of the presidency relative to being a moral agent.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Anybody? Tom, first.
Sure, I'll jump into that. I think the primary motivator for Eisenhower was not, as I say, exegetical, which is to provide moral leadership, but his primary motivation, I think, was his response to duty, his call to duty, and that really requires, you know, some careful looking at and definition of duty. He did, however, view his role as president as moral leader. And that's the reason I think he joined the church and was baptized after he was president. He didn't want to join the church beforehand because he didn't want to be charged with using church membership and his joining the church for political ends. But like Washington and Jefferson and others, he started attending church regularly as president and continued to attend church after he left the White House, but he continued to attend church as former president. So I think he did, I at least saw some sense of providing moral leadership in that regard.
Maybe I misunderstood your comment and your question, but did you say that people are afraid of this, the president acting as an agent of moral change? But don't you think also one of the messages from the election was that they did want, a lot of voters did want the president, and so it's ambivalent. Okay. Because I didn't read this quotation from Kennedy, but as I was reading this over, considering the new predominance of the Christian right or the evangelical Protestants, in his second State of the Union, Kennedy said, this was after the Cuban Missile Crisis and after the close confrontation, the fear of nuclear war, Kennedy said, "Liberalism, faith in man's ability, reason, and judgment is our best and only hope in the world today." Can you imagine that being said today? Liberalism is our best faith and our best and only hope in the world today. I think it would be pilloried, right? This type of faith in an abstract secular concept like liberalism has been almost banished from political public discourse. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is going to be fostered upon the international community. Mm-hmm. I think there's an equal fear that, and I don't think you get that ambivalence mm-hmm. about the position of the presidency in the 18th and 19th century. Mm-hmm.
Again, this may not directly answer your question, but remember, Eisenhower was vilified by the Democrats for his lack of moral leadership relative to McCarthy and to civil rights. this irrespective of what he did, the role he played to help silence McCarthy, and despite Brownell and Earl Warren and his sending troops to Little Rock and so forth, because according to the Democrats he didn't use the White House as a bully pulpit, certainly reflects expectations of the president providing moral leadership at least. And the fact that Ike decided to provide, I think, his principal moral leadership in basically in terms of issues relative to nuclear warfare, which also ultimately that also made the Democrats, I think, very uncomfortable because they did not politically want to fight on the grounds of the morality of nuclear weapons as Eisenhower wanted to.
I had a quick question for Elizabeth. Based on, again, with contemporary issues, there's been a great interest in having President Bush apologize or admit some failures or to have a sense of guilt about mistakes. Did Truman have any sense of guilt or any willingness to apologize for using the atomic bomb, or did he see that as something he didn't have to apologize for?
He publicly, I don't know about, and privately, I've never found it in letters or in his writings, but publicly he said from time to time when asked that he made his decision, he knew it was the right decision, that he had prayed about it, but he knew it was the right decision, and that it had never given him any trouble sleeping.
Interesting.
Okay. Bill D'Antonio has a question.
Yes, I want to pick up on Tom's comment about the word liberal, the way Kennedy used it. I think there's an interesting irony there. It's true. It has achieved a very bad reputation, but I want to point out how I used it in the Boston op-ed on October 31st, and it was picked up and rewritten in the New York Times last Sunday. I wrote an op-ed on the relationship between divorce rates and education, and then surprised everyone when the article showed that the state with the lowest divorce rate in the country is Massachusetts. And that if you look closely, the states with the lowest divorce rates are down the northeast coast from Maine to New Jersey, and then some of the Midwest states that look rather blue. The point I was making was that if you look closely, the education rates of these states are the highest in the country. Massachusetts has the highest completed high school rates and the highest completed college rates. And if you look across the red tier, you find the highest divorce rates. The article was picked up and written with a slightly different focus in the New York Times, but the point I made in the article was I picked up on both Bush and Cheney talking about those Massachusetts liberals. If you remember the debates, both of them used the phrase. And I said it's those Massachusetts liberals who invest in education. Unfortunately, you call investment taxes, and if they're taxes, you're not interested, and you pay the price for not being willing to invest. So, yes, the word liberal has a burden, but I think if we are willing to fight for it, we might show that indeed Kennedy was really right.
Yeah, I wondered if this is something that's lost. This was my thesis, that Kennedy was able to merge those points. He was able to be the secular icon and the Catholic hero. But the blueprint hasn't been followed. It's been lost, and because there is a Renaissance and Enlightenment tradition that also can merge with Catholicism.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, another question from the audience, please.
Well, granted, if Kennedy wasn't particularly interested in being a president that had a Catholic worldview that informed what he did, given his own understandings, but do you think that any Catholic who tried to be a president based on a Catholic understanding of life could have been elected in 1960, and if so, could have genuinely pursued policies that reflected that worldview, given where America was at that time?
No, I agree with you. I think that he managed the issue perfectly, and in fact, there was great frustration from some Republican Catholics. James Mitchell was Eisenhower's Secretary of Labor, and he put together this 8-page memo and frustrated with how Kennedy was appealing to the Catholic voters, and he would win based on as I showed in the map, the electoral votes of those northeastern Catholic states, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania. But Nixon had a gag order on the issue. Nixon thought that to discuss the issue would And in one perspective, he was afraid of anti-Catholicism. In another perspective, pragmatically, he thought it could backfire on him, and he would lose more Catholic votes, because there were ministers. Billy Graham privately wrote to Eisenhower and said, "You should really use this religious issue," and he wrote to Nixon and said the same thing. You should use this anti-Catholicism to try to get some votes. And Norman Vincent Peale publicly did this just before the Houston speech. He publicly said, I'm not saying that the country would fall, but the culture wouldn't be what it is, which was a thinly veiled question about a Catholic's ability to separate church and state. So on the first point, I do think that Kennedy had to do that. The question then is, what about today? Now that the barrier has been breached, do Catholics continue to have to distance themselves from religion? And that's, I think, part of the problem we saw in the election with John Kerry that William D'Antonio discussed. So there's a discomfort with talking about religion, and it seems like a lot of Americans were looking for a religious message.
May I ask a question? Just the prerogative of the moderator, because our keynote speaker tonight, Paul Kenger, had asked a question of the first panel, and I think it's very appropriate to ask it now, because I've heard from probably 6 of the 7 presentations in some form or another the assertion that the role of religion in the life of this or that president has been underestimated by scholars, major writers on these presidencies, and just pose this question as well to this group as he did to the first panel. Why do you think that's the case, if indeed that is true?
It is true of Truman. If you take just 3 of the recent best biographies by Robert Farrell, David McCullough, and Alonzo Hamby, all 3 of them in some way or another underestimate the role of religion and his faith, Truman's faith, and the influence of it on his politics. Probably Hamby gives it the largest sense that it had something to do with his politics, but then it's a very quick, I mean, it's a huge biography, 800, 900 pages, and it's just a mention. And Farrell does a little bit, but that's also hundreds of pages of biography. So I think some of it has to do with, we don't talk about this so openly. Mm-hmm. Some of it has to do with scholarship, even though 2 of those 3 books are more popular biographies. They're still written by scholars. And McCullough, maybe it's just not important to him. I don't know, because clearly he didn't have an editor who made him stop writing, because that's also a very big biography. It's great, but it's a long book. He could have put it in if he had wanted to put it in. I think that with Truman, you had to have read, which they did, but you had to have read with a keen eye his longhand notes. And a lot of his speeches and press conferences have references to scripture and everything, so I don't have an adequate answer, but that's partially answering it.
I mean, it's a puzzle because the public record is there, and you're
Right.
relying upon the same letters, original documents as these other scholars who haven't given so much emphasis to it. Yeah, Jack?
Well, I don't have an adequate
Tom, I'm sorry.
answer either. If one has to be careful about making generalizations about the outward signs of inward grace, I think one also has to be careful about making generalizations about the outward signs of inward disgrace. And why biographers say of Eisenhower, the 2 that come to mind are Ken Davis and Stephen Ambrose, why they miss the depth of Eisenhower's religious concerns and commitments as president is something that's a little hard to fathom. Both of them, both Davis and Ambrose, of course, write fulsomely about Eisenhower's religious upbringing as a youth. But there's a disconnect. Once Ike goes off to West Point, it's the biographers drop the religious theme. Why do they do this? Well, one is tempted to say in both Ambrose's case and Ken Davis's case that these are very secular men for whom religion in the church is not very important. But I don't know that. I mean, that's what's tempting to say, but I don't know that for sure. And unfortunately, I can't talk to either one of them now about why they ignored what I think is the evident religious story of Ike in the White House.
Okay.
But that's what one is tempted to say.
Thank you. And I had said 6 out of 7, and I was accepting you, Tom, as the one who was not saying that
I
there
thought
was
so, right?
Yeah,
I
but
thought so. If religion is underestimated in biographies of Kennedy, it's Kennedy's fault in a sense. It's Kennedy's responsibility because he was very ironic about it. He told at campaign rallies, he told priests, wear your sports shirts and don't wear your Roman collar, because then they'll be talking about me as the Catholic candidate for president. And it's very ironic speaking to Arthur Schlesinger and Ted Sorensen, his chief aides. He said, "You Unitarians keep writing these Catholic speeches for me." So he didn't have a sense of himself as, again, a theologian.
great. Thank you. Well, Gleaves Whitney, the director of the Houndstein Center, would like to make an announcement, and I certainly hope you will all join me in thanking our panelists for this wonderful panel.
Well, I think I speak for everybody in this room. These panels have not disappointed. I mean, we've had 10 speakers in all to this point, and they've been very stimulating speakers. Lots of questions have been raised. And while I want to praise all the panelists and your contributions, I also want to praise the audience. You're generating some wonderful questions, and I appreciate your participation as well. Just 2 things very briefly. I want to remind you that at 8 o'clock tonight, we're going to have our keynote address for the evening. Paul Kengor, who asked a question after the first panel, will be giving the keynote address at the Ford Museum Auditorium, 8 o'clock. We hope that you can make it. Bring some friends. Let's fill that auditorium for what's going to be a very interesting address. The second thing I wanted to remind you is that this conference resumes tomorrow morning. It does not resume here. It resumes on the Allendale campus, 13 miles west of here. It starts, you can come out there, and I'll even feed you breakfast. If you can get out there at 7 a.m., we'll have breakfast from 7 to 8, and then from starting at 8 o'clock, we'll start up with the panels again. We'll have a total of 3 panels, and just very briefly, I wanted to mention to you, over lunch, we're going to have a delightful speaker. This is a man who portrays H.L. Mencken, and he is a scream. Anybody who has seen Chuck Schallberg do H.L. Mencken comes away full of laughter and mirth. So hope you can join us as well tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you all for a wonderful start to this conference.